Sergeant Kellen, nicknamed Ghost not for his stealth but for the haunted look permanently etched around his eyes, stood at the lip of the earth, watching the entrance shrink the world. The air above Tay Ninh in late October 1968 was a suffocating soup of heat, diesel fumes, and the incessant buzz of insects, a deafening clamor designed to mask the quiet death below. Kellen was the best tunnel rat they had, meaning he was the most broken, the one who found the Earth's darkness less terrifying than the sun's blinding reality. Today's target was designated the Viper's Nest, a command complex discovered 3 days prior, suspected of harboring critical NVA planning documents. The entrance was small, almost concealed entirely by a low-hanging root system, forcing Kellen to enter headfirst, dropping into the humid blackness. Lieutenant Davies watched him, sweat soaking his fatigue collar. We estimate 14 minutes from the initial shaft to the choke point, Ghost. If you hit that junction and don't signal back in 15, we start mining the perimeter. 15 minutes. 14 minutes of calculated silence before the chaos, and then the final, definitive quiet of explosion. Kellen checked the load on his suppressed Smith & Wesson Model 19 and the single fragmentation grenade clipped to his belt. He carried minimal gear, no helmet, no radio except for the thin, unreliable wires spooling behind him, his only tether to the noise and sanity of the surface. His immediate concern wasn't the VC. It was the physics of the Earth itself, the crushing weight and the utter dependence on the integrity of the air he breathed. The duality of this duty was cruel. Moments of intense, blinding violence separated by hours of psychological torture, where the only enemy was the ticking of his own blood in his ears. He exchanged a final, unspoken nod with Davies, a gesture of respect for the necessary sacrifice, and plunged into the dark. As the jungle sound faded, replaced by the faint echo of dripping water, Kellen's mind began its habitual cataloging of fear. The smell of decaying organic matter, the temperature drop signaling the stability of the soil, the slow, agonizing separation from the world of light. He knew the fight would be fast. It was the waiting for the fight, the anticipation of the shadow, that truly hollowed him out. The initial descent was a near-vertical drop of 8 feet, cushioned by packed dirt and roots. Kellen landed softly, instantly engulfed by a darkness so profound it felt like a physical pressure against his eyeballs. He switched on his small, diffuse beam flashlight. The shaft, initially wide enough for a crouching man, quickly became hostile, forcing him to crawl on hands and knees, dragging the thin communication wire that now represented his lifeline. The air was stale, thick with the scent of mildew and something else. A metallic, slightly sweet odor that veterans recognized instantly as the recent presence of human sweat and cooked rice. He followed the winding corridor, his M19 pistol leading the way, his senses screaming caution. Suddenly, the communication wire snapped taut, then went slack. He tested it gently. The connection was severed. Whether cut by VC or damaged by debris, the result was the same: isolation. The surface world was gone, replaced by an absolute, terrifying silence. His breathing, already shallow due to the exertion, suddenly seemed thunderous. Every rustle of his fatigues against the damp earth sounded like a breaking branch. This isolation amplified the waiting. Every minute was stretched into an eternity, where the absence of sound was the loudest threat. He pictured the men above, listening to the static, assuming the worst, their faces grim. His immediate focus shifted from clearing the tunnel to controlling the raw, primal urge to panic, to claw his way back to the light. He knew panic meant death down here, suffocated by his own fear long before a VC bullet found him. The tunnel narrowed sharply ahead, forcing him to shed the small pack containing water and extra ammo. This next section, according to the map sketches, was the Mandible, the choke point, a section notorious for its structural instability and tight dimensions. Designed not for transit, but for defense. Kellen swallowed, tasting the fear. The true test of the tunnel rat wasn't courage. It was the endurance of the silence. Kellen reached the Mandible section, and the reality was immediately worse than the briefing described. It wasn't merely narrow, it was engineered to be a tomb. The ceiling dropped until it brushed his back, and the walls squeezed his ribs. He had to lie flat on his stomach, arms extended, pistol held awkwardly, moving forward by dragging his elbows and pushing with his boots, the true coffin tunnel. This wasn't movement, it was being extruded by the earth. He felt the cold, gritty soil pressing against his face, tasting the dust that rose with every movement. He was now functionally blind and mostly deaf, his world reduced to the raw sensation of pressure. He checked his watch, 3 minutes since the wire broke. The psychological clock for the 14-minute mission started ticking viciously now. He had committed to the choke. Retreat was now nearly impossible, and certainly slower than proceeding. In this confined space, the waiting became unbearable. He couldn't pivot, couldn't draw his grenade, couldn't even properly use his sidearm. He was a worm in the dirt, entirely vulnerable. The silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic, terrified thudding of his own heart, now so loud it vibrated through the soil and into his teeth. He focused on the rough texture of the ceiling, trying to identify man-made supports versus natural rock, looking for the telltale signs of a tripwire or booby trap placed right against his exposed skin. He had to assume he was being watched, that the VC knew he was struggling through this geological bottleneck. The only combat he could offer now was the resilience of his mind, the refusal to succumb to the overwhelming pressure of the earth and the anticipation of sudden violence. The minutes stretched, measured only by the agonizing inch-by-inch shuffle. He felt a sharp rock dig into his hip, and for a terrifying moment, he confused the pain with a knife thrust. The absolute silence was fracturing his ability to distinguish reality from the panic taking root in the deep recesses of his oxygen-starved mind. Minutes 4 through 7 were dedicated to resisting auditory hallucinations. The absolute silence became a canvas for Kellen's mind to paint terrors onto. He distinctly heard a scraping sound ahead, metallic on stone, followed by a faint, wet cough. He froze, muscles locking, pressing his cheek against the damp soil. He held his breath until his lungs burned, straining to filter the sound from the noise of his own internal systems. The sloshing of blood, the clicking of joints. Was it real? Or was the lack of oxygen making his subconscious play tricks? The pressure of the tunnel was turning him inward, making him doubt the fidelity of his own senses. He tried to mentally trace the path of the sound, triangulating its origin, but the claustrophobic space distorted all acoustics. He slowly, agonizingly, felt ahead with the muzzle of his pistol. His hand brushed against something smooth and curved, a clay water gourd, freshly broken. The water had not yet fully soaked into the earth. They were here, and they had been here recently, perhaps within the hour. The knowledge brought a strange wave of relief, mixed with heightened dread. The waiting was nearly over. The fight, when it came, would at least be tangible, a measurable enemy, unlike the suffocating specter of the silence. He shifted his focus from the psychological to the tactical, relying purely on touch. He felt for subtle changes in the floor texture, hoping to detect a pressure plate or a buried mine. The smell of the gourd's contents, stale, slightly fermented rice water, was a powerful confirmation. He realized the silence hadn't been an absence. It had been a calculated trap. The VC hadn't moved because they didn't need to. They simply waited for the intruder to crawl into their sight line, expecting the darkness and pressure to do half the job for them. The waiting was the weapon, and Kellen was the target. The clock hit minute 8. Kellen felt the narrow passage begin to pitch downwards. Ahead, the resistance of the soil changed drastically. He encountered a wall of debris, the choke point. Not a natural constriction, but a deliberate collapse, reinforced with split bamboo shoring and layers of densely packed mud. This confirmed the intelligence. This was the main defensive line. He was forced to stop his forward momentum and begin the frantic, desperate work of digging, clawing at the earth with his free hand, unable to maneuver a shovel or even his own boot to scrape. His position was catastrophic, completely exposed if an enemy was behind him and fully focused on the obstacle in front, leaving him wide open to a trap on the other side. The air quality deteriorated rapidly as his exertion released ancient dust and methane. He fought the urge to gulp for air, forcing shallow, measured breaths. He worked quickly, driven by the brutal calculus of survival. The faster he dug, the sooner he'd reach the enemy, but the sooner he'd trigger whatever defensive mechanism lay beyond. His fingers, raw and bleeding, scraped against something thin and metallic buried in the mud. He carefully excavated it, identifying a short length of thin, copper-colored wire, the residue of a trip flare or an improvised mine fuse. They had mined a collapse. The VC hadn't just blocked the tunnel. They had wired the expectation of its clearing. He abandoned the wire, realizing he couldn't disarm anything in this position. His only option was brute force and speed, hoping that the collapse was old enough that the mechanism had rusted or been rendered inert by the water. He pushed hard against the remaining rubble, using his shoulder as a battering ram, ignoring the searing pain as sharp edges ground into his ribs. The pressure was monumental, both from the earth and the terrifying realization that he was deliberately triggering a potential explosion. He had been sent here to endure the silence, but the silence was now demanding an act of violent, blind commitment. At minute 9, the earth fractured. Kellen hammered his shoulder against the last segment of the wooden shoring. With a sickening crunch of wet wood and grinding stone, a section gave way, opening a small, jagged aperture just large enough for his head and pistol to pass through. The absolute silence of the coffin tunnel was instantly shattered by a new, immediate threat: movement. On the other side of the hole, a low, guttural warning cry erupted in Vietnamese, followed by the clatter of a bolt cycling. Kellen did not hesitate. He thrust the suppressed M19 through the opening and fired twice, the sound a horrifyingly loud, concussive fut-fut that reverberated through the small chamber, deafening him instantly. He heard a sickening thud and a strangled cry immediately beyond the opening. But the action wasn't over. A second man, clearly alerted, was reacting. Kellen withdrew his pistol an inch, knowing he couldn't pivot to assess the target. He fired 3 more shots into the void where the sound originated, the muzzle flash momentarily blinding him, throwing distorted shadows against the freshly exposed chamber walls. The smell of cordite mixed violently with the stale tunnel air, an acrid perfume of combat. The exchange lasted perhaps 3 seconds, a brutal, blinding spasm of violence against the protracted psychological waiting of the previous 8 minutes. Then, as suddenly as it began, it ceased. The gunfire noise collapsed back into an oppressive, ringing silence, a silence made heavier, dirtier, and more terrifying by the recent violence. Kellen lay panting, his ears ringing so violently he couldn't hear if there was returned fire or movement. This was the duality realized. The fighting was fast, but the silence that followed, pregnant with the expectation of retaliation, was the true crucible of fear. He waited, pistol steady, listening to the agonizing echo of his own accelerated breathing, convinced that the rest of the complex was now racing toward the sound. Minutes 10 through 12 were spent in the agonizing aftermath of contact. Kellen forced himself to slide through the hole, scraping skin from his torso, emerging into a small, dry storage chamber. 2 figures lay motionless. A young VC soldier slumped against a rice sack, and another, older man with a map case clutched in his hand, killed by the last burst. The fight was definitively over in this section, but the danger had exponentially increased. The scent of blood, hot and metallic, mixed with the pungent smoke. Kellen resisted the urge to inspect the bodies. He was far too exposed. He quickly retrieved the map case, confirming the intelligence that this was the main access to the command post. He couldn't go forward alone. The sound of his firefight had acted as a general alarm for the entire complex. He had achieved his primary objective, locating the critical intelligence and confirming the viability of the path. Now came the worst part. waiting for backup while knowing the enemy was converging. He had to assume the next chamber was mined, fortified, or already occupied. He pressed his back against the cool earth wall, pistol trained on the passage leading deeper into the complex. The silence now was not the empty, pre-combat dread. It was a loaded silence, the stillness of a predator calculating its strike. He checked his watch. He had been underground for nearly 15 minutes. The pressure in his chest was not just physiological. It was the realization that he was pinned, victory achieved at the cost of his own secure retreat. He needed to withdraw to the choke point and wait for the surface team to breach the entrance shaft. The profound psychological impact of the fight was the immediate, violent end to the psychological torture of the crawl, only to have the torture return, intensified by the knowledge of the bloodshed. The decision to retreat was instantaneous, driven by tactical necessity and the overwhelming exhaustion settling into his limbs. Kellen knew the clock was against him. He couldn't carry the dead, and the map case was his only prize. He stuffed the documents into his fatigues and turned, facing the narrow aperture, the coffin tunnel that now represented the journey back. The claustrophobia was intensified by the knowledge that he had alerted the entire complex. Every inch of the crawl back was a betrayal, exposing his back to the possibility of a VC soldier entering the cleared chamber and dispatching him with ease. The silence of the retreat was colder, more insidious. He imagined the subtle shift of earth behind him, the whisper of air that would precede a knife thrust or a final bullet. He forced his body back into the crushing, tight space, moving in reverse this time, pushing with his arms, pulling with his legs. This movement was even more difficult than the entry. He was exhausted, his adrenaline spiking and crashing repeatedly. He focused on the raw, physical reality of the earth, the grit beneath his fingernails, the cold dampness against his spine. He deliberately slowed his breathing, trying to mask any sound that might carry back to the map chamber. The silence in the tunnel now felt like a living entity, an unseen sentinel guarding the complex, mocking his short-lived victory. He measured his progress not in feet, but in heartbeats, agonizingly slow increments toward the main shaft. The 14 minutes of official mission time had elapsed, but the minutes of survival were still being counted silently against the immense weight of the earth. After what felt like an hour, but was likely only 3 or 4 minutes, Kellen felt the glorious, liberating expansion of the tunnel walls. He had cleared the Mandible. He pulled himself out of the coffin, collapsing onto the slightly wider main corridor floor, savoring the ability to flex his knees and turn his torso. He retrieved his discarded pack and strapped on his harness. He found a frayed end of the communication wire. He tried to splice the wires together, fingers shaking uncontrollably from the adrenaline dump and exhaustion, but the connection was irrevocably damaged. He pulled on the wire, using the old prearranged signal. 3 hard tugs, pause, 3 hard tugs, contact made, require extraction. He repeated the signal, waiting, listening to the vast, hollow echo of the main shaft. Moments later, he felt a faint return tug on the wire, the signal acknowledged. They knew he was alive and had located the objective. The anticipation of their arrival was overwhelming, a tidal wave of potential relief. He slumped against the wall, pistol ready, staring down the main corridor toward the entrance shaft. He was safe for the moment, but the final psychological battle was raging. The transition from the silent world of his own survival mechanism back to the noisy, chaotic reality of war. The silence he had endured had reshaped him. The brief fight had merely been a necessary interruption. He was waiting now for the cacophony of his comrades, the sound that would bring physical safety but not necessarily mental peace. The lingering fear was the knowledge that the absolute quiet of the tunnel had revealed something fundamental and terrifying about his own vulnerability. The rescue arrived not with a whisper, but with a tearing, grinding sound as Davies and 2 Marines began frantically widening the entrance shaft above, determined to bypass the complex winding path. A beam of harsh, unfiltered jungle sunlight suddenly pierced the darkness, followed by the clatter of boots, and the shouted, indistinct voices of the surface world. Kellen shielded his eyes, the light stabbing painfully after the prolonged darkness. Davies dropped into the shaft, his face a mask of sweat, relief, and shock at Kellen's appearance. Filthy, bleeding from countless scrapes, and profoundly still. Ghost. Status? Report. Davies demanded, pulling the sergeant upward. Kellen was hauled out into the blinding, humid afternoon. The noise was overwhelming. Distant artillery rumbling, the squad milling, Davies barking orders. Kellen stood, swaying slightly, clutching the stolen map case. He was safe. The 14 minutes of subterranean isolation, punctuated by 3 seconds of blinding violence, had ended. Yet, the question the mission posed, was the silence worse than the fight, had been answered unequivocally. The fight was instinct, adrenaline, and skill. It demanded action. The waiting, the suffocating silence had demanded pure mental endurance, forcing him into a terrifying intimacy with his own impending death. As he looked around at the clamor and the blinding green life of the jungle, Kellen realized that the silence he had just escaped was not truly gone. It had burrowed deep inside him, an enduring echo of the coffin tunnel, proving that terror was not the sudden boom, but the long, protracted wait for it.